Thank you, Viet, for being here. You've been a great supporter of the AWM. You came to us when we were a very early institution that was not well known and brought a group of authors to talk about The Displaced, which is an amazing anthology. You were extremely helpful in us putting together and being able to launch our exhibit, My America, which was a wonderful multimedia exhibit in the museum and has become an online exhibit, and not only that, but a giant piece of our educational curriculum. And you were nice enough earlier this year to do an online program for our festival with Maxine Hong Kingston, which was wonderful. If you haven't seen it, it's on YouTube. But so for that alone, we could give you an award. But obviously, there are a lot of other reasons, as Grove mentioned. And what we're here to talk about tonight is inspiration. And so I'd really just like to open it up to you to kind of talk about what are the things that inspire you to write.
You know, well, as was mentioned already, I'm a refugee. I came from Vietnam in 1975 at 4 years of age. And, you know, we settled eventually in San Jose, California. My parents opened perhaps the second Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose. And, you know, it was a difficult life, as you could imagine. And my salvation was the San Jose Public Library, because my parents were working, you know, constantly almost every day of the year. And it was really, you know, difficult for me to watch this happen. And so I ran away to stories. I ran away to the library, and I just immersed myself in literature. And this is how I learned English. And, you know, it was where I learned to be a reader, but also ultimately where I learned to be a writer. So in the third grade in San Jose, I wrote and drew and bound my first book, Lester the Cat. Lester was an urban cat, stricken with ennui, bored with city life. He fled to the countryside. There, he found love with a country cat. Well, that was what I did at about 7 or 8 years of age, and the San Jose Public Library gave me an award for that book. So I'm forever grateful to the San Jose Public Library for encouraging me. Yeah, absolutely. And setting me on the path to more than 30 years of misery in trying to become a writer. Yeah. So that's the inspiration. You know, I mean, I felt that growing up as a refugee in California and in the United States, that it was urgent for us to tell our stories, you know, because obviously in the 70s and the 80s, I also grew up watching almost every movie that Hollywood made about the Vietnam War, which is an exercise I recommend to nobody, especially if you're Vietnamese. And so I realized that, you know, in this country, we didn't have a voice, we didn't have a presence, we were just an excuse for an American drama, and that it was absolutely important for us to tell our own story. And so that was my origin as a writer.
And you know, that...
Thank you, thank you.
And that leads kind of directly into my next question, which is, when you wrote The Sympathizer, I mean, obviously you had books before that and your short story collection, but when The Sympathizer came out and it really exploded, not just critically, but commercially, and was in multiple languages and around the world, I have to assume that other people who felt what you felt found some inspiration in that. Do you have a story of somebody who may have felt that way?
First, let me just say that HBO is making a TV adaptation of The Sympathizer.
Yay!
Yeah. Which means that if you haven't read The Sympathizer yet, you never have to read The Sympathizer. You can just watch it on TV, okay? Yeah. Well, the big thing about that is that Robert Downey Jr. is cast in The Sympathizer. He is not playing The Sympathizer.
Okay, I was going to say.
Yeah. But he is playing every single white man in the novel. Yeah. And my 9-year-old son, Ellison, is thrilled that Iron Man is going to be in this book, yeah. You know, the great thing about The Sympathizer is that it has reached all kinds of people that I never would have expected. And so, you know, it has been translated into many languages. And it's actually really cool to me that I can go to France or Germany or Italy and meet people who have read this book and have been really touched by it. Haven't been to Turkey, but it's been, you know, there in Turkey, and people message me there. Ironically, it's not available in Vietnam in Vietnamese, okay, which hurts me deeply, you know, because I wrote the novel not to inspire people, Because inspiring people is one function of literature, but another function of literature is to offend people. I mean, we're in an age right now in the United States where people want to ban books, which is awful. But it's also cool, because it means that books actually matter for somebody out there, that they're angry enough about these books to think, oh, we can't allow our children to read these things, right? And so the sympathizer was designed to offend everybody. I do get hate mail from everybody. I get hate mail from Americans telling me to go back to Vietnam if I love communism so much, which means I never finished the book. I know that there are my fellow Vietnamese Americans who don't like this book because they fled from a communist country, and the novel is told from the perspective of a communist spy. Like, we don't want to read this novel from that perspective. And then, of course, in Vietnam, they don't think I'm an anti-communist. They don't think I'm a communist. They think I'm an anti-communist, right? So, part of the joy of writing is to know that I can reach out and touch people. And so I do get messages from Vietnamese Americans and mixed race people, because the protagonist of the sympathizer is part French and part Vietnamese. And a lot of mixed race people reach out to me and say, look, we rarely see our experiences depicted in this way. But it's also important to me that I make people angry. Because you know this, in curating the American Writers Museum, a lot of the writers that you curate were not popular in their day. They're dead now, so you can like them, but in their day, they were pushing buttons. And that's part of what the function of literature is supposed to do, push our buttons both for the positive and for the negative as well.
Yeah, and I would agree that inspiration is not always inspiring from joy. We might inspire people from anger, and definitely that's a great way to look at it. As we mentioned before, too, you have done a lot of inspirational work that does not necessarily reflect on the page. And one of those is the organization that we were talking about earlier, the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network. Now, you founded this a few years ago, and I'm curious about what's the focus and how is it working to help inspire others?
The roots of that organization actually come from my college days at UC Berkeley. UC Berkeley stands for the University of Communists at Berkeley, in case you don't know what that means. So I went there, and I was immediately okay. So the background of this is that I grew up in San Jose, California, and I had a great education in the Catholic schools of San Jose. I mean, it really screwed me up in a lot of ways too, but a really great canonical education. But a very white education at the same time. So I went to Berkeley. It's the first time I ever heard of the term Asian American. I was like, oh my God, we're not Orientals, we're Asian Americans. That's awesome, right? And also then I heard about, that the fact that we could call ourselves Vietnamese Americans as well. And I thought, well, we don't have that many stories about us, and we should also not just write our own stories, but support each other in telling our stories. And so my friends and I back then started a Vietnamese American arts organization, maybe one of the earliest, maybe one of the first in the country, and we called it sort of melodramatically Ink and Blood. We're like 20 years old. But eventually, over the course of 30 years, it became a 501c3 organization called the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network. And again, the impetus behind that is that, look, it's very important to be a writer and to tell your own story, okay? But I'll tell you a little anecdote. When the Sympathizer first came out, it got a front page review in the New York Times Review of Books, or New York Times Book Review, which is a big deal for a writer. All right, a lot of writers would probably kill their mothers to get a front page review. But the review said in the third line, Viet is a voice for the voiceless. And I screamed inside my head. I was like, have you ever met any Vietnamese people? Been to a Vietnamese restaurant? We're really, really loud. We're not voiceless. And I quote Arundhati Roy on this. There's no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the silenced and the preferably unheard. So to be called a voice for the voiceless is actually not a compliment. It's a way for people to say, we only want to hear from one person, not from your entire community. And the whole impetus behind the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, yes, is not to have voices for the voiceless. It's to abolish the conditions of voicelessness, to create the conditions for more and more writers to emerge. Because honestly, I am frickin' old, okay? I got a request from somebody yesterday to speak at a program as an elder I'm like, what? But it's honestly probably correct, because there are young Vietnamese and Asian American writers and writers of color in their 20s and their 30s, and they're writing about vampires and lesbians and all this kind of stuff. That's awesome. I would never be able to do these things. But that's what an arts organization should do, is to create the conditions not to replicate people like us, the elderly, but to create conditions for newer and younger writers with fresher ideas.
That's awesome. They and along with that organization, obviously, another way that your work and your life inspires is through teaching. And I'm kind of curious, both from your perspective as a teacher, how you feel that you can inspire, and maybe if there are some teachers that really inspired you.
Well, I did do that conversation with Maxine on Kingston, and Maxine was my teacher at UC Berkeley, so I'll tell you a little story. I came to UC Berkeley. I got into Maxine's class at 19 years of age, and it's really hard to get into her class. You know, classes at Berkeley are huge, and this writing class was 14 students. So I got in, and every day I would come into the seminar, beautiful wood-lined room in a small space. I would sit about 5 feet away from Maxine on Kingston, this world-famous writer, author of The Woman Warrior. And every day, I would fall asleep. This went on for an entire semester. End of the semester, Maxine writes everybody a letter. My letter says, hey, I've noticed that you're falling asleep every single day in class. You seem to be really alienated. You should make use of Cal's excellent counseling services. Well, I didn't make use of those counseling services. I became a writer instead. But I've never forgotten that, because it taught me a couple of things. Number one, when I see my own students falling asleep in class, and it happens fairly often, I don't call them out. I don't know what's going on in their lives. And number two, inspiration can take a long time to happen. Because Maxine's work, I think, in The Woman Warrior, Chinaman, Tripmaster Monkey, I read all those books when I was in my 20s. It took a long time for the impact of those works to seep in before I was mature enough to understand what she was doing. And every time I teach my Asian American literature course, I teach The Woman Warrior. And I've done it many times, and it constantly rewards, and it still speaks to students today, some 46 years after it was published. And this is inspiring to me. And it inspires me in knowing that sometimes I will have an immediate impact on students. I can read my evaluations. I didn't bribe these people, and they'll say nice things about what my courses have done. And sometimes I will see that my own students have published books. Jean Ho, Fiona and Jane, just came out last year. Vanity Fair calls it, or one of the best books of 2022. She was my student. So sometimes there's an immediate impact. But sometimes people will reach out to me 10 years, 20 years later and say, hey, I was in your class, and it made a difference to me. And so that's really part of the inspiring power of being a teacher, is never knowing exactly what kind of an impact you've made. And we've all had teachers. And some of us have reached out and said thank you to our teachers, and I'm sure many of you have not reached out, even if that teacher has made an impact on your life. And that teacher will die never knowing that they've mattered. So if you had a teacher that mattered to you, reach out to them soon, okay?
And so on that note, and yes, we should applaud that, I want to focus. Last thing I'd like to focus on is then we've talked about teaching, especially at the college age. We've talked about writing and the people that you've inspired. But on those tables, and you'll have to fight for it because I'm not sure how many copies are on your table, is a very important children's book that just came out. And tell me about that children's book and your relationship to it and who actually wrote it.
The book is called Chicken of the Sea. And for most of you, when you hear Chicken of the Sea, you think the tuna, okay? But the title actually came from my son, Ellison. And Ellison is actually named after Ralph Ellison, the novelist, who made a huge impact on my life through Invisible Man, which I read in college. And here's another little anecdote. I never met Ralph Ellison, but I met someone who met Ralph Ellison, and that was Professor Emory Elliott. Emory Elliott, the late Emory Elliott, was a famous Americanist. He's written some very important books on American literature, but he was also a West Point cadet. And in the late 1960s, Emory Elliott, as a West Point cadet, escorted Ralph Ellison around West Point before Ralph Ellison gave his lecture at West Point. And then I was invited to give the same lecture at West Point. And I thought, I have to do this. Even if it was really terrifying, because the lecture given to 1,000 plebes, the first-year cadets, and I was there in front of these 1,000 cadets, and I was like, every single person in this room is stronger than I am, okay? But I thought it was really important to accept that invitation, as Ralph Ellison did, because when we talk about the power of literature and teaching and inspiration, part of what we're talking about is this idea that stories can build bridges, stories can unify us, that whatever our conflicts are as a people, as a culture, as a nation, we can hope at the very least that we can try to find a common story, that we can try to find a story that can inspire, entertain, and unify us. And that's what Ralph Ellison did. That's what I hoped I would try to do at West Point. So I named my son after Ralph Ellison because I wanted to pass on this legacy and this very complicated legacy in our country, right? I mean, when I say I'm naming my son after Ralph Ellison, I'm saying it's not just because he was a great writer, but because he himself embodied this genealogy, that he was named after Ralph Waldo Emerson, and that the very idea of Ralph Ellison and Invisible Man invokes this idea that we as a country are founded on slavery and genocide. So the American dream is all of these kinds of things, right? It's very complicated. That's what I mean when I name my son Ellison. So anyway, Ellison, the little boy, is incredibly expensive. I don't know if any of you remember this. Children are expensive. My own father, when I was about 20, gave me an itemized bill detailing all my costs, okay? I haven't done that to Ellison yet, but I'm gonna do it one day. But anyway, so I've raised Ellison in a household, I hope, of music and books and literature and art and the love of ideas. And I took him to an artist colony, the Gerasi resident artist colony above Stanford. Carl Gerasi invented the IUD and then used the benefits, the profits, to found an artist colony. I know there are a lot of rich people out there. Think about it, okay? So the Gerasi colony. And then I took him there, and he met T. Bui and Bao Phi, who had done a children's book he really loved, A Different Pond. And that very night, he went home to our little studio, and he wrote and drew Chicken of the Sea, 5 years old. And the story is about bored chickens who become pirates. I could never come up with this on my own. So I posted it on Facebook, and McSweeney's editor reached out to me and said, "Is this for real? Can we publish this?" And I said, "Can I make money off my son?" "Absolutely." And so T. Bui colors the book. Her son Hien, who was 13 at the time, drew the illustration. So it's a total family endeavor. And I hope it does inspire, because I hope it does show, and this is one of the most important things about being a writer that I've learned myself, is that, as we get older, we forget that art and inspiration comes from being children. That children have no barriers, they have no calcification, they have no ideas about the rules, they'll do whatever they want. It's so beautiful. It's also very painful if you're a parent, but anyway, it's very beautiful. And so, when I wrote The Committed, I took inspiration from my son, because the primary question I asked myself when I wrote The Committed was, why not? Why can't I do something? And I think that's what children ask. Why can't I do this? Why do I have to listen to these adults? And so that's where inspiration comes from. That's the beauty of children's literature. And I am such a believer in that power of children's literature, and that we have to expose our children to these ideas and these stories, and then we have to expose ourselves to children as well.
And on that note, I think that is the heart of what we want to talk about, and I want to thank you so much, Viet, for joining us. Thank you, everybody.